If you've seen my stories on social media, you already know I'm a huge J. Cole fan, and I think for me, this may have overtaken Forest Hill Drive. But let me know what you think. Is this J. Cole's best work? What's up, gang, and welcome back to another episode of Inspired By, a series where we look at the musical trends, past and present, to understand the techniques used so that you guys can make better music. My name's Will, and I make an assortment of music under the moniker Hush Child. So looking at the musical trends, sometimes that might mean making assumptions about what's going to be the newest sound. Now, Timbaland, who produces on Amari alongside T- and J. Cole, of course, has always been on the forefront of the new up-and-coming sound. And I'm going to make an assumption that we're going to hear more of this offbeat hi-hat pattern in a lot more tunes. The thing I noticed when listening to this is, of course, that hi-hat is extremely high in the mix, but everything else is extremely low in the mix. And the instrumental is definitely scooped to make focus of J. Cole's vocals and message. And I'm going to show you how to make something super similar in this video. And just quickly, don't forget, this is inspired by. So we're not trying to make a like for like remake of J. Cole's track, but we are trying to follow some of the musical techniques. Let's jump into it. Here's my percussion section, just soloed, and I'm going to go through how I made this section first. Just really pay attention to the dynamics of all the elements. What bit stays highest in the mix and what parts are ducked. Of course, I made the hi-hats first. It's just the absolute standout part of Amari's mix. So the hi-hat pattern kind of reminded me of triplet 16ths. So notice how it's not quite to the grid. There's a humanistic feel there. All I did was mute those middle notes. Not perfectly on the grid. What I did was kind of shift these a little bit until they felt right with the vibe that I was trying to go for. And I started with this little tuplet here. I've thrown my hi-hat sample that I got from Splice into Sampler, and that's why it's on this MIDI layer. I'm not just working with samples. Thrown that first downbeat just on a lower register, so there's some kind of dynamic there as well. And then underneath, a slightly different sample. I've warped it and set it to beats, the forward transient mode, and brought the envelope down to 25. And I've just added a slight fade in so that these pitched hi-hats that we have here are not as staccato as the lead hi-hat, we'll call it. And all together we get this. Slightly different location the fourth time round, so we don't land on this line. We've just got a little bit of an offset. So again, add into that kind of bounce. With the hi-hat, I was using the disperser, and I've just pinched that frequency to the key of our song. You can see here, F, and that's gonna create that kind of sharp tone that we hear in Timbaland's beat. I've used sausage fattener to give it a bit of kind of saturation, some distortion, and then just the EQ8 there to take off some of the highs. If you're not using disperser, as you see here, you can actually just pinch the frequency and bring it up in your EQ. And then in the overall hat group, I'm using the Haas effect just to pull it to the right a little bit and take it away from the center where the kick and snare are going to sit. And then I've added a little bit of a side chain from the kick, so anytime the kick plays, we've just ducked that hi-hat volume a little bit. I don't want to bombard the track with highs, even though it is kind of the lead hook to the track, because of course we're going to use this with a vocal. So moving on to the snare, I'm super proud of the snare because this is the kind of snare that we hear in a lot of Sir's tracks. Sir, the artist of Top Dog, of course, kind of got a tone to the snare. And the way I went about creating this is I first took this cashmere snare. Of course, you can hear me sending that to return A, which has got the Valhalla on it, and then just EQing it there, taking out some of the frequencies that I didn't like. And I'm putting it into this snare group, which again, I'm using the disperser, and I'm just picking out a frequency that I want to hear within that snare. using the glue compressor to kind of bring it all together in this group, the limiter to keep it at that ceiling height, and then the transient master just to take away some of the punch, because it was super crispy when I first brought it in, and again, you don't want to detract from that important vocal. So I had this cashmere snare, and it was kind of, you know, it's got a bit of tone there, but it doesn't have that crispiness. So I took this Esther rim shot that you guys have heard me use a bunch of times, and I pitched it down so it suited where my snare was sitting, which you can see is pitched up 9 semitones. So I've kind of pitched this down to meet a certain pitch of the 2 drums, and then just EQ'd it, and that's all I've done, and then thrown it into this group here. So both of them together sound like this. And the important thing to note about the snare is the first time it plays, it's just a little bit offset from that downbeat marker there, and then slightly closer but still offset the second time it plays. And again, that gives it that humanistic feel as if a drummer's played it. And then finally we get to the kick, which I've grouped with the 808 because I didn't want it to be super obvious that we had a kick and maybe it was side chaining the 808 or something like that. So I've put it in a group so we could saturate it together, but I'll come to that. With the kick, what I did was play the track and play a bunch of different kick samples next to the track. And one that I've been using recently is this kick here. In Splice, it's a little bit bassy and it's got a lot of tail. So immediately I've trimmed that down. Beats, transients, forward mode, and then the envelope is on 50, and I've pitched that down a little bit more. So that's got more of a click to it now. And then started just adjusting this a little bit. So I added the Fab Filter Satin to give it some saturation, EQing it, taking out a lot of that low end to about the 50 Hertz region, I believe. Yep, 50.5, because I know that 808 is going to be in there. Sausage Fattener again, there was probably no need to use the Satin twice here. But some of you'll know as you're making your track, you're like, oh, I just want that to be a little bit more gritty. So you end up adding plugins on plugins. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you get your sound. But I probably could have just fine-tuned that first Satin a little bit or put it later in the chain. And then EQ again, just to take off some of the brightness that came with adding these 2 plugins. And you can hear that that's quite dark in the mix. It's a lot brighter without that second EQ, and that's because I want the main attention to come from my 808 here. So my 808 sample, I'm just using this L Dusty sample that I got from Splice, and you can see that I've put it into a sampler device so I can have this fade in and out there. The main reason for that is sometimes when we start pitching our sample up, they become far too short. So if you can add a fade here, and you have to play around with your loop start and end point and then create a crossfade, and you should have like a constant 808. So that was the first thing that I did. Just programmed in my 808s really low at the start there, and then coming up to the F sharp, and there's kind of like some little fill notes at the end of each 4-bar loop. But in terms of sound, I knew that it needed some brighter harmonics. I knew that it needed some saturation there. So we tried a lot of different methods, and we ended up just 10% of the sausage fattener there, and then OTT mainly in the mids to boost those frequencies, overdrive, R bass. You know I love R bass. It pulls it out of the laptop speakers, makes that 808 audible through those higher harmonics. And then just taking out any of the frequencies that I don't like, taking out that muddy kind of 300 to 500 Hertz region again, because we're going to have a lot of vocal there, and then just side chaining it with the kick very subtly. It's not coming all the way out. We play that with the kick together. And you can hear there that it's just like super dirty. I added the amp in the group and limited it, and then just brought down again some of the brightness with the EQ8. And then the transient master is just making sure that that 808 and that kick is sitting nice and punchy together. Once I programmed that in, I had my rhythm section. So I was super happy with this, but I was a little bit worried about the next task, which is making the kind of guitar uke sound. It sounds like it's sampled from a record, but I didn't want to make just a like for like recreation. So I thought, what could I use? And originally I used the AGML2, and I would strongly recommend going to Ample Sound and downloading this because this is a free acoustic guitar emulator and it just sounds lovely. I just really like it. So the first thing that I did was add the glue compressor, which kind of just brought down, there was some really bright transients. You can see that I used the velocity in the piano roll quite often to make sure that some notes were much more dull and kind of muted than the others. And it sounded like this. But it was far too bright. So immediately added the transient master from Native Instruments and brought all of the attack down. Still sounding too bright and too tuneful. So I added the vinyl preset of RC20 and messed around with the wobble a little bit, distorted kind of the higher region of the sound and added a little bit of reverb as well, which got us this. Which I liked a lot better, but we still weren't there. So I thought, what's the best thing we can do? So I resampled that and put it on this track here. And then we got a lot closer. So the first thing that I did was just EQ it once more. And again, just picked out some of the frequencies that I really wanted to come through. And then after that, I was like, let me add that RC20 again, because it does sound really warped in the record, and remove some of the things that I had before, but added a little bit more wobble, distortion to the overall sample, and a little bit of noise, which gave us this sound, which I felt was a little bit more of a representation of what we had in the original track. And I panned it ever so slightly to the right as well. But then I used the utility and put it in mono, because now that I'm detuning my track using RC20 twice, I didn't want there to be any phase. So I set it to mono and then I panned that a little bit further right so that there was no phase cancellation or within the track. I absolutely love using RC20, and I think on that note, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. I use RC20 on almost all of my released tracks, and I release those tracks with the help of DistroKid, who's today's sponsor. DistroKid makes it so easy to release your music on all of the streaming platforms. Often I like to collaborate with my friends, and DistroKid makes it extremely easy to do so because they have this Teams function. And what Teams allows you to do is add the email of your collaborators and give them a percentage of the revenue splits made from your track. Your collaborators do need a DistroKid account, but when you invite them to the platform, they get 50% off. If you want to start releasing your music with DistroKid, make sure that you use the link in the description below, because you'll get 7% off your first year. Now, without any more interruptions, I'm super excited. Let's jump back into the video. Okay, and then from there, I obviously just sidechained it to the kick once again. And then it gets to a kind of interesting place, because some of you might not realize this, but I do think that there's actually a piano in the original track, because we get these tones from what sounds like the 808, but it just has that reverberous sound that you can hear inside a piano. So I did what a lot of producers do, and that I first got from DJ Shadow, and I just took that low piano sample and just put it under our 808. So at this stage, this is what the track sounds like. There's plenty of space for a vocalist to be over the top of this. So at this point, I only need to really add that kind of flute sound. Originally, I had this sample from Splice, but I didn't think it was worth having this kind of pitch bend at the beginning. So I cropped that out, made sure that I made a note of the key we were in, and just faded it ever so slightly at the start. And then just resampled that and put it on the track below. So here it is sitting in simpler, and the first thing that I did was just play in the notes that I wanted. Again, didn't want to recreate note for note the Amari track, so I just went with a similar vibe. I just played that back and forth and sat it with the track. And then I realized that if it did come from a sample like it sounded in the original track, there were some overlaps in some of the tones that the bamboo flute plays. So I made sure that I overlapped some notes there. And then in the key, just made sure that I had those little runs, those little arpeggios up to the note or down to the note that we were going to play. We'll come back to this chorus ensemble because it doesn't actually feature in J. Cole's track, but it was a nice technique that I was playing with afterwards. My effects rack here, I've got the EQ8 again. It's similar to the uke. I'm just picking out the frequency that I want to be most heard and making sure that I don't have too much muddiness down here again at that 300 Hertz region. We're sidechaining it to the kick and we're adding RC retro color again, just giving it this VHS preset. And then again, putting it in utility just to bring up the gain this time. And it sounded like this. Which I really liked. Now, what I added after is not something you have to add, but I think it makes it sound really cool. It makes it sound like it's kind of sampled from a record, you know, the needles jumping a little bit. So if you add your chorus ensemble plugin in Ableton 11 and set it to vibrato, your rate, whatever sounds good, and you just adjust your amount very quickly like I have here, you'll get these kind of stutters and jumps. We've basically got our 16-bar loop. And I absolutely adore it. After this point, guys, it basically comes down to arrangement. When you go into your next section, maybe we're taking out the kick. We're going to play a slightly different 808 pattern. Maybe we're going to take down the dynamic or filter out some of the hi-hat or some of the drums altogether. Take out the snare. It's all about playing with the arrangement around the vocal. I've just got that initial loop there, but something that I noticed in the original track is kind of this tweeting digital lasers. I took just the initial sound from this sample, just that bit, and drenched it in reverb. And then what I did was made sure that I pitched these differently each time. So if we double click, this one's just in its original position, and we go -4 semitones down, 4 semitones up. Some of them are 2 semitones, you get the picture. And then took out the white noise and just kept that tweet kind of frequency that we wanted to hear. Added the glue compressor to keep everything tight and the same, and sidechain this to the actual master track because I wanted everything to push down the sharpness of these tweets, as I've called them. And then we're left with this. And it's just this kind of skippity that plays over the metronome. Listen to J. Cole's track and listen to that second half section of the loop and you'll hear that digital laser sound, those tweets that I'm talking about. And do let me know in the comments below what you think that sound is, because I really had some trouble making it, but once I had these in there, I do think it really adds to the track and I do really like them. So that's definitely, you know, kind of a little sound design tip of just some experimentation there, and it definitely works. Finally, a tip that I've been using from a disclosure stream is to imagine running my sounds through some outboard as if I was in the studio, some analog gear to give it that grit and give it that warmth, and that really brings the entire track together. So I just added RC20 again, surprise surprise, and just took the wobble up to just 2%, really not doing too much, distorting it to about 50% or just under, and adding just a little bit of this digital send. It's not too noticeable there, and then just taking off any of those muddy frequencies with the overall EQ there. Let's have one last listen to the finished loop, and yeah, let me know in the comments if this was helpful and what you want to see in future videos. So there we have it, guys. This is my take on a J. Cole, Timbaland, Amari inspired track. Let me know if you found it helpful, and do let me know what you want to see in future episodes. As always, the stems to this project is over at my Patreon, which you can find in the description below, as is anything else I've mentioned in this video or previous. For now, guys, I thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.